Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 13, Death, Part 3. In returning to the question posed at the beginning of this letter, did the serpent of Genesis simply lie? We are now able to answer, no, he did not lie. He opposed to divine immortality another immortality, that of crystallization from below above, or the Tower of Babel. He advanced the bold program, but real and realizable, aiming at a mankind which would be composed of the living and of ghosts, with the latter reincarnating almost without delay and avoiding the way which leads through purgatory to heaven. You see now, dear unknown friend, why the Church was hostile to the doctrine of reincarnation, although the fact of repeated incarnations was known, and could not remain unknown, to a large number of people faithful to the Church with authentic spiritual experience. The deeper reason is the danger of reincarnation by way of the ghost, where one avoids the path of purification in purgatory, illumination and celestial union. For humanity could succumb to the temptation of preparing for a future terrestrial life, instead of preparing for purgatory and heaven during earthly life. To prepare for a future terrestrial life, instead of preparing for the confrontation with eternity, amounts to crystallization in the sense of the formation of an electric double, the body of the ghost, which could, in its turn, serve as the bridge from one incarnation to another, and be the means of evading purgatory and the confrontation with eternity. One ought, during earthly life, to prepare for this meeting with a fully awakened consciousness, which is purgatory, and for the experience of the presence of the eternal, which is heaven, and not to prepare for a future terrestrial life, which would amount to the crystallization of the body of a ghost. It is worth 100 times more to know nothing of the fact of reincarnation, and to deny the doctrine of reincarnation, than to turn thoughts and desires towards the future terrestrial life, and thus to be tempted to resort to the means offered through the promise of immortality made by the serpent. This is why, I repeat, the Church was, from the beginning, hostile to the idea of reincarnation, and did all that it could so that this idea would not take root in consciousness, and above all in the human will. I confess that it is only after hesitation, due to objections of a very serious moral order, that I have decided to write of the danger that the doctrine of reincarnation entails, and above all of that abuse that can be, and is in fact, made of it. It is the faith that you, dear unknown friend, understand the weight of responsibility that weighs on each person who sees himself treating reincarnation not as belonging to the domain of esoteric, i.e. intimate experience, but as an exoteric teaching to popularize, called to convince everyone, which has determined me to speak of the practical abuse of the fact of reincarnation. I implore you, therefore, dear unknown friend, to have the goodwill to examine, in the light of moral conscience, the question whether the way of treating reincarnation in exoteric teaching that has been adopted and is practiced in general, both by representatives of the French occult movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, and by theosophists, anthroposophists, Rosicrucians, etc., is justified and desirable. I may add that in the last analysis it is a matter not only of the moral danger of evading purgatory and the experience of eternity, but also of replacing one immortality by another, namely that of God by that of the serpent. For there are two deaths and two immortalities. The death of which the Father speaks in the parable of the prodigal son, "My son was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found," Luke 15:24. is remoteness from the Father and his house, whilst the death of the physical body means remoteness from the physical plane and the electrical field of terrestrial gravitation, which was the matter in question in the 12th letter concerning the arcanum, the hanged man. Now, the refusal to take the way of purgatory and heaven amounts to refusing to return to the house of the Father, i.e. the decision to remain remote from the Father. And it is precisely this which is death in a divine sense. Complete crystallization is therefore complete death from the divine point of view, whilst complete life is the state of radiating as the sun, i.e. that of complete decrystallization. Thus the divine words, "You shall not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for on the day when you eat of it, you will die," state simply that the day when you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will remove yourself from me. And the promise of the serpent, "You will not die," means to say, you will live remote from God, and it will be I who shall attend to the uninterrupted continuation of your life in the horizontal, for I shall make up for the lack of divine wisdom and love by replacing them with the intellect and with psychophysical electricity, which will be the source of your life. Therefore the serpent understands by life what God understands by death, and vice versa. Now Hermeticism, Christian Hermeticism, as well as ancient and pre-Christian Hermeticism, has always advanced the fundamental thesis of all true mysticism, true Gnosis, and true sacred magic, that there is vertical life and death, and that there is horizontal life and death. For Christian Hermeticism, the cross of humanity, the cross of Calvary, is that of two opposed lives and deaths. Resurrection is not only the triumph of life over death, but is moreover the triumph of life over life. It is the victory of the vertical over the horizontal, of radiation over crystallization. This is why when the women who went to the tomb at the break of day did not find the body of Lord Jesus, the two men who appeared to them in resplendent apparel said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Luke 24:5. Therefore let us no longer seek amongst the dead for he who is living, and above all let us not seek for immortal life in the domain of death, in the domain of the intellect born by electricity, or, to employ an image borrowed from the Kabbalah, in the domain of Samael mounted on the dragon. It is not phantoms and ghosts which are the source of certainty of survival or immortality. The source of this certainty is found elsewhere. Where then? In the experience of the kernel of the human being and his relationship with the breath, light and warmth of God. Certainty of immortality issues from the participation experienced in that which is intrinsically indestructible and imperishable, and therefore immortal. He who has had experience of the kernel of his being, i.e., he who has once been truly himself, permeated by the divine breath, bathed in divine light and ardent with divine warmth, he knows what immortality is and that he is immortal. You will have beautifully explained to him the epiphenomenon of nature of consciousness, i.e., that consciousness is only the functioning of the brain and nervous system, and that it is like the rainbow, a play of colours resulting from the refraction and reflection of solar rays on the clouds. You will have beautifully said all this, and he will have not even a little grain of doubt that all this is false, and the contrary is true. Perhaps he would not be able to find valid arguments for you against epiphenomenalism, but as for him, he has no need of them. For it is not to arguments that he owes his certainty, but rather to experience. Imagine the reaction of a St. John of the Cross or a St. Teresa of Avila to a discourse, armed with all the arguments of modern science, addressed to them so as to prove to them that the soul is only a mirage produced by chemical and electrical reactions of the organism. To prove this to them, they who many times went out of the body, left in a state of complete insensibility, and returned full of life and light, drawn not only from beyond all chemical and electrical reactions, but also from beyond all sense imagery and all intellectual activity. I think that they would have sent the author of such remarks either to a psychiatrist or to an exorcist. Certainty in immortality can thus be absolute, i.e. in no way dependent on the validity or invalidity of arguments, nor on the good or bad attestation of outer facts. It is when man has had experience of the kernel of his own being and of his essential relationship with God. I certainly know the logical, philosophical, and psychological criticism of the Cartesian argument, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and I accept it without reserve in foro scientiae, but it was not the force of this argument in the tribunal of science which gave René Descartes certainty of his transcendent self, the kernel of his being, but rather the experience in the tribunal of consciousness, in foro conscientiae, where, whilst thinking in the admirable way which was characteristic of him, he went out of discursive thought and found himself suddenly as the thinker of thoughts. It was therefore not a logical argument, but a real and intimate experience of thought in the process of thinking, which gave Descartes complete certainty of the reality of the I am, which manifests itself in the I think. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant, a soul of childlike purity, endowed with a remarkable honesty and diligence, made Descartes' spontaneous experience a new method of inner effort aspiring to knowledge, namely the transcendental method. This method amounts to the effort to transcend the thinking in which the thinker is ordinarily immersed, by going out from it and elevating himself above it, in order to observe thought, or to think about thought, from a point of observation taken above discursive thought. Kant's Copernican discovery consists above all in detaching the thinker from naive thought, i.e. from the state where the thinker is lost in the process of thought, being immersed in it, so as to occupy a point situated above thought, from where the thinker can examine what is thought in an entirely detached way, and with implacable and incorruptible truthfulness. This is the transcendental criticism of Kant. His works, Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Judgment, are the fruits of the application of this method in the sense of the revision of the totality of our knowledge, and in the sense of a clear investigation of the pretensions of the intellect and of the senses to being able to judge things belonging to the metaphysical domain, for example, God, the immortality of the soul, and moral freedom. With respect to his Critique of Practical Reason, we find here, beyond the results of the critical look of the thinker turned towards the domain of discursive thought and sense perceptions in which he had been immersed before, in addition, what the thinker, this kernel of the human being, has to say himself. This can be summarized as follows. I would have to alter the foundation of my very being, or to annihilate myself, if I were to say that God does not exist, that I am not free, and that I am not immortal. The very structure of my being is such that it postulates categorically the existence of God or infinite perfectibility, freedom or morality as such, and the immortality of the soul or the possibility of infinite perfectioning. It goes without saying that just as René Descartes' argument, I think, therefore I am, became the object of the annihilating criticism of logicians, philosophers, and psychologists, so is the fundamental argument advanced by Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Practical Reason the subject of a no less severe criticism, and no less founded in foro scientiae, than in the case of Descartes' argument. But here also it is necessary to say that it was not a logical conclusion, or an argument of discursive thought, which gave Kant certainty of God, freedom and immortality, but rather the real and intimate experience that he had when he practiced his transcendental method. This latter evidently proved itself to be an authentic spiritual exercise, which led Kant to arrive at experience of the kernel of his being, just as Descartes arrived there, and from which he drew the threefold certainty, the reality of God, the reality of moral freedom, and lastly, the reality of the soul's immortality. Similarly, in Hindu Jnana Yoga, the yogi arrives at the transcendent self by critically observing firstly his body and arriving at the experience, this body is not the self, then critically examining his psychic life, desires, feelings, memory, images, etc., to arrive at the experience, this psychic life is not the self, and lastly, critically examining his thinking itself, from which he detaches himself and experiences the thinker, just as Descartes and Kant arrived at the experience of the transcendent self by rising from thought to the thinker. From this comes their certainty of I am, Descartes, and I am free, I am immortal, and I am in the presence of God, Kant. May the criticism of Descartes and Kant eventually become silent, restraining itself through understanding. May it no more interfere with that at which these two spirits arrived, namely the intimate experience of the kernel of their being, the transcendent self. May it one day cease from being repeated to satiety that Kant proved himself to be unfaithful to his own method, and to have betrayed his own principles, and that, in growing old and becoming senile, he sank into the Fideism of his youth. For the truth is that Kant betrayed nothing, and did not sink into anything, but that he arrived at the ripe fruit of his life and work. Or would one wish that he had not arrived anywhere, and that he had finished his life as a master of criticism and doubt only? that the honest and assiduous effort of his life had not brought any experience, and therefore any certainty, with regard to things belonging to the metaphysical sphere. Instead of rejoicing in and celebrating the fact of his certainty, one speaks of his lapse, and one accuses him of unfaithfulness. Good Lord, how petty! You see, therefore, dear unknown friend, that the great thinkers of the West, just as the Hindu yogis, have arrived at the experience of the kernel of the human being, the transcendent self, the experience of which gave them certainty of immortality. Christian Hermeticism, being a synthesis of mysticism, Gnosis, and sacred magic, offers humanity three methods of experience, beyond the philosophical method outlined above, for arriving at the certainty of immortality. There is, in the first place, the traditional mystical way of purification, illumination, and union, which is the voluntary and conscious experience of the three stages of the way of the human soul after death, through purgatory to heaven, and from heaven to God. You will find this not only with the great Christian mystics, such as Dionysius the Areopagite, Bonaventura, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross, not only in the pre-Christian teachings of the Hermetic treatises attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, such as the Divine Pymander, but also in the great mysteries of pagans, Egyptians, and others, where the three stages of catharsis, or purification, photismos, or illumination, and kenosis, union or identification with the divine, give consciousness of the post-mortem states and certainty of immortality. Jean-Marc Rivière says concerning this, quote, "This is the essential teaching of Egyptian esotericism, as well as that of the Greeks, the knowledge of states after death in order to overcome fear of this death, psychological and human fear. The initiate had knowledge of what awaited him. What could he be afraid of?" Jean-Marc Rivière, Histoire des doctrines ésotériques, page 90. Just as the practice of concentration is the art of forgetting, and the practice of profound communion, or meditation, is the mastering of the art of sleeping, so does the contemplation of authentic initiation signify the mastering of the art of dying. It is through mastering forgetting, sleep, and death that one arrived in the past, that one arrives today, and that one will arrive in the future at the mystical experience of the soul united with God, and therefore at the absolute certainty of immortality. And one arrived there, one arrives there, and one will arrive there through the three stages of the eternal mystical way, those of purification, illumination, and union. St. John of the Cross shows that it is authentic faith which is revealed, acts, and increases in purification, that it is hope which is simultaneously both the agent and the fruit of illumination, and that lastly it is charity which achieves union of the soul with God. See John of the Cross, The Ascent of Mount Carmel 2:5. This is the eternal way, and no one can invent or find another. One can certainly divide it into 33 stages, or even into 99 if one wished. One can reclothe it in intellectual vestments or beautiful and simple symbolism. One can present it in diverse terminology, Sanskrit, Kabbalistic, Greek, Latin, etc. But one will always have to do with the sole way, and always the same way, of eternal mysticism, the way of purification, illumination, and union. Because there is no other, and there has never been another, and there never will be another. Hermeticism also has no other way to offer than that of eternal mysticism, the Gnostic, magical, and philosophical methods being founded on it. In other words, one cannot dispense with purification in order to become a Gnostic, or a mage, or even a philosopher, in the true and original sense of this word. Nor can one any more dispense with illumination in Gnosis, in sacred magic, and in philosophy, again in the true and original sense of this word. For a non-illumined Gnostic would not be a Gnostic, but rather an oddball. A non-illumined mage would only be a sorcerer, and a non-illumined philosopher would be either a complete skeptic or an amateur at intellectual play. And with respect to the primary source from whence the Gnostic draws his revelation, the mage his power, and the philosopher his enlightenment, there is only one, the more or less immediate contact of the soul with God. It is therefore always the same way on which one advances, without regard to whether one employs the mystical, Gnostic, magical or philosophical method. There are many tracks, but there is only one way. This means to say that whatever one does, one advances and grows only in the sense of purification, illumination, and union, and that whatever one knows and whatever experience one has, the criterion of true progress is solely progress in purification, illumination, and union. One judges a tree by its fruits. One judges the mystic, Gnostic, mage, and philosopher by their faith, hope, and charity, i.e., by their progress in purification, illumination, and union. Spiritual greatness, the caliber of a soul, is measured only through faith, hope, and charity, or love. Buddha certainly saw that the world is sick, and, considering it incurable, he taught the means to leave it. Christ also saw that the world is sick unto death, but he considered it curable, and set to work the force for healing the world, that which manifests itself through the resurrection. Here is the difference between the faith, hope, and love of the Master of Nirvana, and that of the Master of the resurrection and the life. The former said to the world, "You are incurable, here is the means for putting an end to your suffering, to your life." The latter said to the world, "You are curable, here is the remedy for saving your life." Two doctors with the same diagnosis, but a world of difference in the treatment. Tradition teaches, and every serious esotericist and occultist knows that it is so, that the Archangel Michael is the archistrategist, i.e., that he directs the celestial army. Why is he in charge? Because his faith, hope, and love are such that they have put him in charge. For to be in charge signifies in the spiritual world to be less subject than others to doubt, despair, and condemning judgment. Tradition teaches that the Archangel Michael represents the sun, and similarly the Archangel Gabriel, the moon, the Archangel Raphael, Mercury, the Archangel Anael, Venus, Zachariel, Jupiter, Oriphiel, Saturn, and Samael, Mars. Why the sun? Because the sun is the visible symbol, the image itself of faith, hope, and love. It sheds light on the good and the wicked without leaving or quitting its central post. Yes, the greatness of God himself, i.e. of what is divine for us in him, is not his power in the sense that he is stronger than the totality of forces in the universe, nor his foreknowledge in the sense that he foresees, as a perfect engineer, the future functioning of the forces of the world machine, pre-calculated and predetermined, nor even the fact that he is absolutely indispensable as the center of all gravitation, spiritual, psychic, and physical, of the universe. No, what is truly divine in God, i.e. what makes every knee bow before him, is his faith, his hope, and his love. For just as we believe in God, so also does God believe in us, but with a divinely greater and more elevated faith. His hope with regard to this immense community of free beings that we call the world is infinite, just as his love for these beings is infinite. We do not worship God because he is able to do more than us, or because he knows more than us, but rather because he has more faith, more hope, and more love than us. Our God is infinitely noble and generous, and not only all-powerful and all-informed. God is great through his faith, hope, and love, and the fear of God is basically that of offending such nobleness and generosity. Now, Christian Hermeticism is based on the way of eternal mysticism with regard to its practice. This is its basis and its point of departure. Point of departure where? In the domain of Gnosis and in that of sacred magic, just as in the domain of Hermetic philosophy. Gnosis, which, it goes without saying, has nothing to do with any method borrowed from the teachings of Gnostic sects or with their articles of faith, is the contribution of mystical experience to understanding and memory. It is distinguished from pure mysticism in that the latter amounts to the experience in which the will, purified and illumined, is in union with the divine, whilst understanding and memory are excluded from it and remain outside of the threshold of mystical experience. And it is precisely the fact of the non-participation of understanding and memory in mystical experience which renders it inexpressible and incommunicable. Gnosis, on the other hand, is the same mystical experience with the participation of understanding and memory, which pass the threshold together with the will and remain in a state of wakefulness. It is schooling by means of symbolism which renders them capable of participating in the mystical experience of the will without lapsing. They participate only as witnesses, i.e. they maintain complete silence and only play the role of a mirror. But the result of their presence as witnesses to the mystical experience of the will is the ability to express and communicate this experience. This is because understanding and memory have received an impression of it, and this impression is what we understand here by Gnosis. A mystic is a Gnostic insofar as, and as much as, he can express and communicate to others his experiences. God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. 1 John 4:16. This is a mystical statement. God is the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is a Gnostic statement. Or, I and the Father are one, John 10:30, mystical statement. In my Father's house are many rooms, John 14:2, Gnostic statement. Gnosis is therefore the fruit of the silent participation of understanding and memory in the mystical experience of the will. I say silent participation because otherwise, i.e. in the case of active participation, it would no longer be a matter of revelation, but rather of a statement produced by the understanding and imagination. For in order to apprehend, one has to listen, and to listen one has to be silent. The faculty of understanding and that of memory imagination must be silent if they want to apprehend, i.e. to receive a revelation from above. Just as Gnosis is the fruit of the participation of understanding and memory in the mystical union of the will with God, so is sacred magic the fruit of the participation of the three forces of the soul in mystical union with God with regard to one's neighbour and to nature. When the soul, having had the experience of union with the divine, turns towards its neighbour and towards nature, not in order to contemplate, but in order to act, then the soul becomes that of a mage. Every mystic is a mage inasmuch as and insofar as he acts, being inspired by his mystical experience. Sacred magic is the putting into action of what the mystic contemplates and what the Gnostic apprehends through revelation. Hermetic philosophy, lastly, draws its conclusions from mystical, Gnostic and magical experiences and works, with a view to setting these in accord with the experiences of terrestrial life and with the sciences which are occupied therewith. It is thus that Hermeticism can give trismegistic, or thrice greatest, certainty of immortality, i.e. the threefold certainty of mystical, Gnostic and magical experience. As you see, this certainty is produced in 3 or 4 stages of descending revelatory movement, from above below. It is what tradition calls the descent of the heavenly Jerusalem, as opposed to the method outlined above of the construction of the Tower of Babel. Christian and pre-Christian Hermeticism therefore belongs decidedly to the extended tradition which practices the method of the descent of the heavenly Jerusalem, which works in the history of mankind with a view to preparing the whole of mankind for the future spiritual event of the descent of the heavenly Jerusalem on a universal scale. For the descent of the heavenly Jerusalem is at the same time a practical method of spiritual schools. The totality of inner mystical, Gnostic and magical experiences of individuals, the gradual transformation of the whole of human civilization into a celestial city, i.e. where the laws are those of heaven, and lastly, the reintegration of the whole of nature, which is a work of cosmic significance, together comprise the realization of a new heaven and a new earth, Revelation 21:1, where the world is healed. The descent of the heavenly Jerusalem therefore comprises the most intimate experiences of individual souls, as well as the history and evolution of our planet, according to the law. Nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Matthew 10:26. For everything that takes place in subjective intimacy will one day become objective reality. It is the magical law of history that the subjective at some time becomes objective, and that the aspirations, thoughts and feelings of today become the events of history tomorrow. For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. Hosea 9:7. This leads me to return to the card of the 13th major arcanum of the tarot. Here we see that death reaps hands, feet, and lastly heads, which appear above the level of the black soil. He does not reap growing grass or whole human figures, which, moreover, are not to be found here. Death acts as the guardian of a determined level, and cuts off every member of the human body which appears above this level. It acts as a surgeon rather than as an exterminator. But what kind of surgeon is it? We have spoken above of the method and ideal of the construction of the Tower of Babel, i.e. the method and ideal where one makes electrical energy ascend, after having animated and intellectualized it, from the physical organism to higher planes, firstly to the vital or etheric plane, the plane where grass grows, according to the card of the 13th Arcanum. This ascent, provided that it is not effected methodically and in full knowledge of its action, i.e. within an occult school, in practice takes place partially. Sometimes it is only the electric hands which succeed in ascending to the vital or etheric plane, sometimes it is the feet, and sometimes it is only the head. Now, death on our card sees to it that the vital world is not invaded by emissaries from the physical world. It cuts off, as a true surgeon, the electrical members of the physical body which appear above the level, which is the threshold of the two worlds, where the realm of the vital world begins. It therefore accomplishes amputations of sick members, sick in the sense that they have usurped a domain of existence which does not legitimately belong to them, before the sickness becomes irremediable. What death does in this card is therefore to act as a guardian of the threshold between the two worlds, and correspondingly to apply a kind of surgery. Now, in general, is not death the principle of surgery in the world? Is it called to kill, to destroy, or does it not have a mission to heal through surgery? The answer that I propose, dear unknown friend, is that death is certainly the principle of surgery in the world. It effects the amputation of members that become unusable, even the totality of unusable members, i.e. the whole physical body, so as to free the whole human being. Just as there is natural medicine which re-establishes health through the rules and habits of a sound life, diet, sleep, breathing, exercises, etc., and just as there is homeopathic medicine which heals by helping the whole organism to overcome the sickness, and just as there is allopathic medicine which combats sickness through opposites, and just as, lastly, there is surgery which saves the life of the organism by sacrificing part of it, so there is in the world a healing mechanism analogously hierarchical to the hierarchical scale of natural, homeopathic, allopathic and surgical medicine. Death corresponds to surgery in the cosmic hospital. It is the last expedient to save life. Beyond it there are three further principles for maintaining and re-establishing health in the world and in individual beings. These correspond to mysticism, Gnosis and magic. Thus, in paraphrasing a slogan from the French Revolution, one could say, mysticism, Gnosis, magic, or death.